The skull with no known human DNA locked away for decades until science revealed something Earth had never seen. They thought it was just an ancient relic, but under the microscope, scientists froze. This skull carried DNA that matched no known human on Earth. If it's not us, then what kind of being left it behind? It all began in the late 1930s when a teenage girl exploring a mine tunnel in Chihuahua, Mexico, stumbled upon a shallow grave. Inside were two skeletons, one fully human and one that wasn't. The second had an oddly shaped skull, larger than a normal human child's, yet light, as if hollowed. Locals called it strange, but buried it in storage. For decades, it sat ignored, until a man named Lloyd Pye in the 1990s decided to investigate. What he uncovered would send ripples through both archaeology and conspiracy circles. At first glance, skeptics thought it was just a deformed child, but the skull didn't match any known medical condition. It was 10% larger in brain volume than a human's, but weighed half as much. The eye sockets were unusually shallow, the jaw tiny, and the bone texture was like nothing in forensic records. Even stranger, there were no signs of a seam where the skull plates should meet in a growing child. It looked as if it had been grown as a single solid structure. That's not how human skulls develop. PI sent samples for DNA testing in 1999. Standard tests failed repeatedly, not because the DNA was degraded, but because part of it didn't register in human databases. The mitochondrial DNA, the part inherited from the mother, was human, but the nuclear DNA, which contains the father's genetic code, was wrong. Machines returned fragments of sequences that matched nothing known on Earth. This suggested either a completely unknown branch of humanity or something else entirely. If the skull was part human, part something else, then its origin story became even stranger. The bone was twice as hard as normal human skulls, with microscopic fibers woven through it. Fibers no one had seen in biological tissue before. These weren't collagen. They were something else. Something almost synthetic in appearance. Tests suggested it could withstand impacts far beyond what a human skull could survive. It was as if it had been engineered. But engineered by whom? When word spread, UFO researchers swarmed the case. They claimed the skull was proof of alien-human hybridization. Pye called it the Star Child's skull, though he admitted he couldn't prove extraterrestrial origins. Critics dismissed it as pseudoscience, while geneticists demanded more testing. But funding was scarce and mainstream. Institutions avoided the controversy. Like the plague, the skull seemed stuck in a scientific limbo, too strange to dismiss, too risky to confirm. Years passed, but technology caught up. In 2011, more advanced DNA sequencing was attempted. This time, scientists successfully retrieved longer strands from the skull's nuclear DNA. And again, huge chunks simply didn't match anything in known human, primate, or animal databases. They were sequences from something that shouldn't exist here. This finding ignited a new wave of theories. Ancient genetic engineering, lost civilizations, even survivors of another world. Not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pointed to conditions like hydrophilis, which can deform skull shapes, but hydrophilis produces thin, fragile bone, and this skull was the opposite, dense, ultra-strong, and perfectly symmetrical. Others suggested it was an undiscovered mutation in humans, but if so, why has it never been seen again in the archaeological record? Where were the other examples? Some theorists proposed that this skull might be a remnant of an ancient hybrid species that lived alongside early humans, a species erased by time and history. If true, this would rewrite everything we know about human evolution. It would also mean our genetic history isn't as linear as textbooks suggest. Instead of a clean family tree, it might be more like a tangled web with mysterious vanished branches. The skull's facial proportions fueled even wilder ideas. The eye sockets were so large and slanted they would have given the being an almost otherworldly appearance. Artists' reconstructions showed a face both familiar and unsettling human-like, but with features that felt slightly off. The shallow sockets meant the eyes probably bulged forward, possibly adapted for low light. That raised another bizarre question. Was this being nocturnal or from somewhere with less sunlight than Earth? Some researchers pointed toward folklore. Across cultures, myths speak of beings who came from the stars and mingled with humans. In Mesoamerican legends, pale-skinned visitors with large eyes brought knowledge and then vanished. Could the skull be a literal fossil of those myths? Or was folklore just a memory of an extinct human cousin that once walked among us? The problem? Oral traditions blur over centuries, making it impossible to separate poetic storytelling from real events. In 2013, another round of advanced testing attempted to sequence the skull's full genome. The results? Frustrating. While technology had improved, extracting and preserving the DNA was still a challenge. Some parts degraded during processing, leaving gaps that couldn't be filled. Yet, the recovered fragments continued to show non-human markers. It was enough to keep the mystery alive, but not enough to convince mainstream science to acknowledge it. The skull also sparked questions about ancien migration. If this being or its ancestors lived in Mexico, how did they arrive? Were they a remnant of an earlier migration wave? From Asia, Africa, or somewhere even stranger? Geological records show that thousands of years ago, global sea levels were lower, revealing land bridges. Could an unknown population have crossed before vanishing, or were they already here, hidden in pockets we've yet to uncover? Skeptics argue that the skull is simply a rare but natural mutation. But mutations occur randomly across populations, and there's still no sign of another specimen like it. The uniqueness makes it both fascinating, frustrating. One-of-a-kind artifacts are the hardest to study because there's no control sample. Without more examples, researchers are left making educated guesses and conspiracy theorists are left filling in the blanks with their own narratives. Meanwhile, pop culture ran wild. Documentaries claimed the skull was proof of ancient alien visitors. Paranormal shows tied it to Roswell. Even Hollywood took inspiration, creating alien designs with oversized heads and eyes. But all this media hype only made real scientists more reluctant to touch the case, afraid their work would be dismissed as fringe pseudoscience. Ironically, the more famous the skull became, the harder it was to study it seriously. By the late 2010s, crowdfunding stepped in where institutions wouldn't tin. Enthusiasts raised money for another round of DNA sequencing using cutting-edge technology. Early results hinted again at something truly bizarre. An organism with partial human ancestry, but also completely foreign genetic material. It wasn't proof of aliens, but it was proof we hadn't mapped every branch of life yet. Unfortunately, before the research could be completed, funding dried up again. Today, the skull remains locked in private possession. Access is limited, and requests for new studies often go unanswered. Some say it's being kept out of public view intentionally, while others claim the owner simply fears damage to the artifact. Without new tests, the mystery remains frozen in time, an unsolved puzzle collecting dust. While the debates rage on, theories still swirl online. Was the Skull, an undiscovered human species. A. Failed genetic experiment from a forgotten civilization? Or could it truly be the remains of something not from this planet? With so little hard evidence, all we can do is speculate. But the fact that mainstream science hasn't offered a definitive explanation keeps the door wide open for wild ideas. One thing is certain, the skull forces us to face the limits of our knowledge. Human history is filled with gaps, and every strange discovery reminds us how little we truly know about our past. Maybe this was just a rare genetic, or maybe it's a whisper from a certain chapter of history that's been erased. Either way, it's a reminder that science is never finished. There's always something stranger waiting to be found. So, here we are, decades of tests, thousands of theories, and still no clear answer about the skull, with no known human DNA. Maybe the truth lies in a hidden lab drawer, waiting for someone brave enough to look. Until then, it's your turn. Do you think this was an ancient human or something else entirely?